If we affirm it is because of the laws of nature, we're assigning to the laws of nature, again, just like materialism, in the case of materialism, some power of agency that you wouldn't expect a linguistic declaration to possess. Mm-hmm. I mean, if I look at an elephant and I say, "Arise, Dumbo," I'd be very surprised if the elephant began to float.
Hello there, welcome to Rational Religion, where we make sense of spirituality. Today we're in dialogue with a very special guest, Dr. David Berlinski. Dr. Berlinski has a noted academic career in mathematics and philosophy. He's also written several books on the history and the nature of mathematics, on the history of astrology, and just over 10 years ago he published The Devil's Delusion, Atheism and its Scientific Pretensions. Dr. Berlinski, thank you very much for joining us.
It's entirely my pleasure. I know your next question. Why am I slouching? I must confide to your viewers, I'm slouching because I made a small error in purchasing this couch. It's meant for somebody over 8 feet in height.
We'll skip to the second question, I think. Tell us a little bit about your background. I mean, we're here in Paris, but you've obviously spent a lot of time in America. How did that work, and what kind of made you settle here?
I don't know. I grew up in the United States. I went to school in New York, attended Columbia University, Princeton University for graduate work. I taught at Stanford. I wandered around the United States. But at a certain point, I figured it was time to get out and do something different, so I came to Paris. My parents had spent a long time in Paris. My father fought in the Foreign Legion. They were refugees from Germany. France was kind of way stop on the way to the United States. So in many respects, it was a natural place to go to. I felt I had certain racines, as the French say, certain roots, or at least certain emotional ties with France. And that was 20 years ago, and I've not had the slightest inclination to change my mind or go back, or even leave this apartment a whole lot.
In terms of your, how people know about you, people know about you often as a critical skeptic of materialism. Has that always been the case, or has your thinking on the matter of materialism evolved and changed over the years?
I don't feel very sympathetically inclined to the question, to be perfectly honest, because I have no idea what a commitment to materialism might involve. I mean, after all, if you look at physics, theoretical physics, all sorts of weirdo entities in physics, right? I mean, is a neutrino a physical object? Is the hypothetical graviton a physical object? Are fields physical objects? We have a kind of ordinary sense of what a physical object is. This is a physical object, right, guys? Yeah. Is mud a physical object? Well, you can't count mud. You can't say how many muds there are. Well, it's a different kind of physical object. It's a non-countable physical object. But at that point, I think a commitment to materialism is flexible and elastic enough to encompass virtually anything. You know, Kurt Gödel, the great logician, had a very shrewd remark about materialism. He says it succeeds to the extent that the materialists assign to material objects all the properties that used to be assigned to non-material objects. So to that extent, it's infinitely flexible. Yes, so I would like to separate myself from any kind of facile criticism of materialism. It's too wishy-washy a doctrine to be interesting.
Part of the modern scientific outlook is the idea of the laws of nature, that they act sort of universally on matter and energy, and they regulate their interactions. Do you think this idea of a law of nature makes sense without a lawgiver?
It's a tough idea. It's a very problematic idea. There's a good question raised by a physicist, or maybe it was a biologist. I don't know. Even biologists can ask good questions. What compels the electron to keep going in its orbit? Well, the electron doesn't really have an orbit. It's kind of a probabilistic cloud. But what compels it in its behavior, whether it's an orbit or a cloud? And the language is very revealing. I discussed this in The Devil's Delusion, a language of compunction, obligation, responsibility. What is that doing within theoretical physics? Why talk about what compels the electron to continue in its orbit? Why talk about it? Because it seems to be irresistible as a question. Why is the damn thing going around and around and around? Well, the answer is that if we affirm it is because of the laws of nature, we're assigning to the laws of nature, again, just like materialism, in the case of materialism, some power of agency that you wouldn't expect a linguistic declaration to possess. I mean, if I look at an elephant and I say, "Arise, Dumbo," I'd be very surprised if the elephant began to float. But very much the same relationship holds between certain mathematical laws and the behavior of material objects. Now, that can't be right the way it's stated. I understand that. And I see from the expression in your eyes, you understand it too. We're all agreed. But what does compel physical objects to respect the laws of nature? Good question.
C.S. Lewis says something quite similar, which is that to say that a stone falls because of the law of gravity is to make it a man and a citizen. And there's a similar concept with respect to, in the Islamic theology, one of the verses of the Quran states that God said to the heavens, "Come ye willingly or unwillingly?" And they responded, "We will come willingly." In other words, there is an obedience between the heavenly bodies and the heavens and the determination of God. And would you say that there is any...
What surah is that, by the way?
I'd have to check that.
Surat al-Hamim, al-Sajda, I think 41.
41? You may be right.
And
on the other hand, if you're not sure, my remark is not going to induce certainty.
The founder of our community, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, he wrote that in Islamic theology at least, there's the idea that every particle and every existent creation of God is in actual fact regulated by an angel, a consciousness behind it. You know, in religious terminology, that's termed an angel. And now we're getting into the realms whereby people do talk about panpsychism, that everything in nature literally has some degree of consciousness. To what extent would you agree with that kind of concept that, you know,
there's something to all of these ideas. They don't disappear. They cannot die. They're very long-standing. They're really ideas that come up to us, both from the unconscious, human unconscious, and from antiquity. The relationship in theology, in Muslim theology, between the divinity, the deity, and the behavior of the material world is not completely different from the relationship as described in Christian theology. After all, a fundamental axiom of Christian theology, as say it is adumbrated in the 13th century, the high point of Christian theology is that God is everywhere conserving the world. Treat that negatively. Without God's support, the world would descend at once into chaos.
Yeah.
The underlying idea in both systems is that the manifestations that we encounter in the physical world are unstable. An interesting question, is the universe stable or unstable?
Yeah.
I know of only one really rigorous paper about this subject. Freeman Dyson wrote a very good paper about the stability of the universe. And there are a lot of results about the solar system. Evidently, at a certain point, the solar system is apt to become chaotic, depart wildly, oscillate wildly, but it's a long way in the future. But fundamentally, the question remains as medieval thinkers thought of it, whether Islamic or Christian.
Yeah. Yeah, there's another verse that talks about that God keeps the heavens firm by his command. So I think it's a very similar concept in both, and probably in wider religions as well, in other religions as well.
The question is, what does the command do?
Yes.
And this we don't really understand. We have some vague understandings. For example, command belongs to a certain group of properties that living systems possess, among which are agency, the ability to affect the material world. Nothing else has that power. I mean, the moon goes round and round and round. It ain't going to ever do anything interesting beyond going around. Maybe one day it will crash to the earth. Maybe one day it'll escape to the heavens. But agency it doesn't have. And the analysis of agency, the inherent power, let's just stick to human beings because, let's face it, nobody's interested in animals in this regard. Let's just stick to human beings. The inherent power to bring about a change in material circumstances, inherent power, it's not caused by anything else, is something for which we have no analysis whatsoever. So when you say God commands the heavens to behave in a certain way, commandment is some aspect of inherent power. It happens to be a divine aspect. I mean, I can command all I want, nothing happens. But I can bring about certain things. For example, I can raise my great cane. Nothing happens, but the cane goes up and down. That's something nothing else can do beyond the living system.
On the question of agency, actually, I think one issue which is a major issue for what I would call materialists, I know you don't necessarily buy into that term, but the kind of standard view in the scientific establishment that matter and energy is all that exists and it operates by the laws of nature, is the idea of consciousness. And where does consciousness come from? Because there does seem to be some kind of disconnect between, electrical impulses in my brain and my conscious experience. So, what is that kind of hard problem of consciousness, and for whom is it a problem?
Not for me. It's one of the things philosophers love. Philosophy is kind of a bizarre discipline. We all understand it. You get a group of guys sitting together in a room, drinking a few beers, and wondering whether they're really zombies. Well, it seems very interesting to them. It doesn't seem interesting to anyone outside the room, and it never has. David Chalmers is a philosopher who made a reputation by arguing that consciousness represents a very hard problem, because the entire history of life on Earth could have proceeded as it has proceeded without anything ever being conscious. Yeah, maybe. The trouble is, from my perspective, is that consciousness itself, as a revealed facet of experience, gets very little by way of subtle analysis. What are we talking about when we talk about consciousness? Well, experience. All right. Is experience the same thing as consciousness? I don't know, it's sort of like it. But surely I was conscious all day yesterday and I can't remember any of my experiences. A typical state of affairs, I might say. And even though I was asleep for half the night, absolutely dead to the world, I'm pretty sure I wasn't unconscious. I wasn't really in a high level of alertness. Now, these are just sophomoric examples, small witticisms. The point is that before declaring consciousness a hard problem, it'd be very worthwhile to have a much more sophisticated understanding of what the thing actually is, if it is a thing at all. And I don't think we have that. We can say things of the sort that philosophers often say, well, my consciousness is unique to me. I have first-person access to my consciousness. And unfortunately, you don't. You'd be much improved if you did, but you don't. Too bad. Absolutely. And I don't have access to your consciousness either. Well, maybe, but as long as I'm sitting here at this edge of the couch, I don't have access to your position unless you get up. Is that what you're talking about when you talk about first-person access to consciousness? No, I don't think so. So what is so special about consciousness as opposed to height or obesity or length or brain power or liver function that makes it a hard problem? Everything is a hard problem in some sense. Why such attention, such devoted attention to the problem of consciousness? Well, I'll give you the answer. No need for you guys to ask me questions. I'll handle both sides of that exchange. I'll give you the answer.
That's perfectly fine.
The answer is that it's easy for philosophers to talk about consciousness. They don't need anything else. They can sit in a room and talk about consciousness till they're blue in the face, and that is just what they do. Occasionally, a neuropsychologist will burst in and say, well, I've figured out what consciousness, Crick, for example, the DNA, the astonishing something or other. The astonishing thing is that book ever got published. That's the astonishing thing. It's all a bunch of neurons firing off in the brain. I've actually found the seat of consciousness. It's the pineal gland, as Descartes would say. The philosophers just give that sort of thing the back of their hand. That's obviously nonsensical. And they keep on talking. And they can talk over several lifetimes, but nothing changes.
In terms of matter, people seem to think that you can reduce it pretty far down, whereas consciousness seems somewhat irreducible.
Yeah, maybe. Look, these terms are, from any kind of sophisticated analytic perspective, so vague, so wishy-washy, so muddy, so covered with a dense cloud. That several related but mixed metaphors stacked on top of one another, that you can say almost anything. There are so many claims that are made frivolously. For example, I guess I shouldn't denounce YouTube videos. Maybe that's not. I was going to refer to a YouTube video where some solemn nincompoop says we're all really made of quarks. You've heard these kind of things. Basically, a human being is only an assembly of quarks. I forgot the guy who was saying it. Or some assembly of molecules, atoms, quarks, neutrinos, muons. Who knows? The question is, has anybody demonstrated that experimentally? I mean, has anybody taken a human being and dissected him to the level of quarks? How do you know he's made of quarks? And only of quarks. But it's also not, in my view, obviously a law of nature. It's just one of the innumerable things that the scientific community blurts out and says. And nobody ever says, hey, where's the experiment showing that? So it goes uncontested. But that's true across the board. Across the board.
So that understanding of that matter is reducible and that human beings are reducible purely to quarks has kind of entered into mainstream thinking, especially with the computer age and the age of information. In the idea that the human brain is nothing more than a very complex computer. And the consequence of this kind of thinking is now that as people start to think about designing artificial intelligence, there's a big industry now that's talking about how there's going to come a day whereby artificial intelligence is going to be smarter than human beings.
Yeah.
It's going to take over humanity. I mean, Elon Musk in particular raises the specter of Terminator 2 in all its glory. And, that artificial intelligence will be the great terminator of humanity, as it were. So, I mean, do you foresee that? And do you worry about this? Does that keep you up at night?
Not for a minute. Not for a minute. I mean, look, let's be honest. We're three smart guys here. We can recognize nonsense on stilts when it comes tripping into a room. There is no such thing as artificial intelligence, perhaps because there's no such thing as intelligence in the universe. But that's another issue entirely. But the idea that some remarkable program is going to malevolently interfere with human life, when we can malevolently interfere with human life to such a much higher standard, is it's just one of those things you wonder, I mean, what do these people think of it? Give me an example. Give me an example of an AI program that really fools anyone, that does something that a 3-year-old child can do.
Yeah, absolutely.
This stuff about the singularity. Who's the guy with the singularity? They want to reduce the human brain to something the size of a postage stamp and put it on a chip. A perfect fit in the case of this guy. This stuff is part of the chatter. And if Elon Musk should be sitting up nights worrying about his batteries, not about the Terminator. But I don't believe he's seriously concerned. I don't believe Stephen Hawking was seriously concerned. These guys are smart enough not to fall for that kind of gibberish.
Why is it so misconceived, in your opinion? The fear.
Well, the fear is, it's interesting. There are a lot of anxieties in the contemporary world because we're all human, and human beings are very prone to anxieties. They have a lot to be anxious about, after all. And every now and then it focuses on something. In Freudian terms, it's a displacement of anxiety to an inappropriate object. And I think since, in fact, computer programs have gotten better, faster, more sophisticated, it's very natural to make a grand leap of extrapolation and saying, another 10 years is going to be a computer program like Hitler, but he won't make those same mistakes. Oh, give me a break. It's not going to happen. This isn't in the future. We can't reproduce. We have no analytic insight into the most trivial of human accomplishments. Walking is one example. Talking is another example. Being able to move in a social environment is a third example. I mean, look at self-driving cars. Sure, they're okay. But that's not a very high standard of success if you're worried about the Terminator, is it? I mean, some self-driving car that crashes into the mail truck is going to destroy the human race? That's not likely to happen.
Moving on to something you're very well known for is your criticism of Darwinian evolution. Do you think the evidence-based Darwinian evolution has improved, got worse, or kind of stayed as bad as it always was, in your opinion?
I think everybody within the biological community realizes there's something incomplete about Darwinian theory. Let's use as neutral a term as possible. Incomplete. It's an unfinished business. Whether it's incomplete in the sense that Newtonian physics was incomplete and needed a radical revision in terms of relativity and quantum theory, or whether it's incomplete in the sense in which, say, synthetic chemistry was incomplete and needed refinement in its techniques before it completely could flower, very difficult to say. What is clear is there's a massive new evidence within molecular biology that was not available, say, in 1960, 1970, 1980. And the amount of evidence, the amount of sheer data, let's put it in a more neutral framework, is increasing almost exponentially. It's very hard to keep up with it, and I certainly can't. But if you have a theory that is as unreconstructed and as badly articulated as Darwinian theory is, and a theory that is so far removed from the standards of rigor and precision common in theoretical physics or theoretical chemistry or mathematics, then it becomes virtually impossible to say which way the evidential winds are really blowing. It becomes a hopeless task. So before wondering whether Darwinian theory has been strengthened or weakened, I would say it needs to be reformulated so that it makes good, clear sense. My sense is that what you might call orthodox Darwinian theory, that is, random mutations and natural selection, a kind of sturdy doublet, has not yet completely accommodated the theory of neutral mutations into a theoretical framework that makes sense. Kimura in 1970 argued very persuasively that most mutations are either neutral or actually not beneficial at all. But this goes back to papers that Sewell Wright published when he talks about the inevitable trajectory of a dynamic defined over an evolutionary space, winding up on rather a mediocre series of intermediate hills with no way of ascending the evolutionary peaks. So this is not a completely new idea, but Kimura gave it a very vivid expression and a very powerful demonstration. I think beyond that, Darwinian evolution as an object of secular awe, that is the endless propaganda hymns devoted in its favor, that's losing some popularity, some credibility. The indoctrination into obligatory respect for a theory that every thinking person thinks deep down is pretty fishy, I think is less strong than it was, say, 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. You don't see children singing hymns to Darwinian doctrine, although there is some recrudescent effort to maintain the orthodoxy. I think some of the oomph has gone out of it.
Right. In your book, you talked about Wallace's problem, the observation of Alfred Russell Wallace, that there are many gifts latent in humanity, which seem incredibly overpowered for if we're just supposed to be reproducing. So mathematical ability, ability, and one of them is language. And the origin of language is an area of research in terms of how did this essentially appear? Because in the literature about design, people say DNA is a language and it conveys information. And we know that information is the result of a mind. But people don't seem to apply that to language itself, human language. What do you make of the theories of the origin of language in terms of a naturalistic framework? And do you think that ultimately it needs to come from a mind originally?
I think the origins of language are about as easy to comprehend as the origins of life, which is to say they are both completely incomprehensible. Mm-hmm. I don't know of any persuasive theory about the origins of language. It's very strange that only one species has ever developed language. Thousands of species have developed flight or sight or vision or olfactory systems. Only one has sort of figured out the usefulness of language, and ever since acquiring it, it hasn't stopped talking. How is that accomplished? Well, Chomsky has one view, say 100,000, 150,000. And the dates are quite fungible. You can change dates at will. There was a single mutation that reorganized the human brain so that it was capable recursively of stringing phrases together. Only one mutation, one individual, and thereafter Ovid in his exile. But the idea of a single mutation bringing about such a dramatic change, as the change between having no language and having a full language, that seems very hard to accept. Very hard to accept. On the other hand, the evolutionary scenarios whereby certain cases and obscure tenses and oblique voices were proved to have a reproductive advantage is almost comical in its absurdity. Did the first guy to master the Greek subjunctive get laid more often? That doesn't make sense. So we're left with a complete mystery.
And it certainly has a religious, there's also, again, a lot of these questions, they're deep questions from antiquity.
Of course.
And, the concept of the origins of language has deep roots within religious thought as well. So the beginning of the Bible, the beginning of the Quran.
For sure.
It begins with the story of language. It begins with, God taught Adam, in the Quran, God taught Adam the names, and the particular word for the names is actually the nouns. So it's about semantic constructions. It's about the meaning of things. And the Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, the founder of the Ahmadiyya community, wrote in a book called Minan ur-Rahman, which means the gifts of the gracious. It's all about the origins of language, and he argues that from the observation of individuals in history such as Akbar, the Mughal king, that feral children who are raised in the wild by animals, they never actually develop the ability to speak after a particular window of time in their infancy.
Sounds like my students. Now I understand. Well, that's absolutely true. There's a critical period in which language can be acquired. But during that critical period, which ends roughly at 8 or 9 years, language is acquired automatically. That's the astonishing thing. It's acquired as automatically as puberty is encountered. Human beings grow arms. There is no effort, no training, no education, no teaching. Language just is acquired automatically. Children, over a period of 2 or 3 years, begin to speak their native language, or as many languages as they hear in the streets.
Yeah.
And after that critical period, it becomes progressively more difficult to acquire second, third, fourth, and fifth languages.
Yeah. In his book Minan ur-Rahman, he particularly uses that argument, that point, that reality, that humans must be taught the language, must be exposed to a language in their childhood to develop language for the rest of their life.
It's true.
That it's not innate, which raises a perplexing question, which is a scientific and a religious question in the sense of where did the first language come from?
Who
was the original teacher?
Who was the original teacher of it?
But wait, you say it's not innate, but that's certainly a non sequitur. Something must be innate.
Yes, absolutely.
Because after all, dogs never learn to speak. However much we may be invested in teaching them to say something, they never get past woof.
Yeah.
Which has to be counted as a failure in its own right. But human children get a long way past woof. They become fluent speakers. So something has to be different.
The capacity seems innate. Though they sort of...
But that's true of the numbers too. The capacity is innate.
And that was Wallace's observation as well.
Yeah, I mean, you take a tribe in South America, peaceful headhunters, for example, busily feasting off each other's brains, and the least idea of differential topology, absolutely inconceivable to them. You take a child from a headhunter tribe, enroll him in a Boston school, send him to MIT, he'll get a field medal. Possibly he'll get a field medal. There is a capacity latent in these people that's been lying there untested, unused, undemanded, unwanted, and unloved for over 50,000 years. But that makes very little sense in evolutionary theory. There's a tremendous burden on the organism to carry around a capacity for language, for abstract thought, for mathematics, physics, for numerical calculations, none of which are used in 50,000 or 60,000 years, for dance, for civilization. Where did all this come from, and why is it latent for so long? It really does seem like an unused gift.
And where's the first teacher from? Especially in the question of language.
There's a very interesting story told about by Eusebius in the 4th century, the Greek chronicler. And he says that in ancient times, before any human beings acquired the gifts or the arts of civilization, a monster appeared out of the sea. Eusebius attributes this story to the astrologer Berossus, the Chaldean. A monster appears out of the sea and very patiently teaches human beings all the arts needed to survive and to acquire the arts of civilization, how to eat properly, what dietary regulations they should respect, how to do mathematics, art, philosophy, music, literature. And that's his explanation for the first instructor in the arts of civilization. Not bad, it seems to fit the facts, although we cannot quite commit ourselves to believing in monsters responsible for the education of mankind, but it fills an intellectual niche because we cannot quite figure out how something as fabulously complex as civilization could have emerged incrementally. No matter how far we go back into the past, we seem to have the appurtenances of a complete civilization, although some parts of it may not be in full force. For example, there's no electricity in ancient Greece, but the apparatus of a civilization seems to be whole and complete anyway. So just as with the case of language or with the case of addition, we have to assume there's something about human beings that made possible the acquisition of a civilization. Something. What that is, we don't know.
It seems that this is a recurring theme in all these questions about origins, be it origin of language, origin of life, or DNA, is the origin is the real problem, because they kind of have to
It's
be there
the tough
all at
spot.
once.
Yeah, it's the tough spot.
Propagation and the development is a little bit easier, but you actually have to have the framework ready.
Don't forget, talking about the first teacher, as you were trying to inveigle me into doing, doesn't really answer the question, because how is it that we're receptive to the teaching of any first teacher? It's the same problem all over again. We are faced with certain problems that recur again and again and again. Perhaps the most flamboyant one is the origins of life, where we encounter a flat imponderable. Synthetic chemists are unable to reproduce under prebiotic conditions. Any sequence of persuasive stepping stones from inorganic to organic. It's been 50 or 60 years now since they're trying, and progress is very, very dubious. In fact, some very good synthetic chemists say there's been no progress at all, although a great deal more sophistication in laboratory techniques, but no essential progress. At a certain point, you want to say, hold on, step back. These results may suggest something, and what they may suggest is we're looking at the problem incorrectly. The fact is we're unable to account for the emergence of language in the human species and the non-emergence of language in any other species in a way that's completely plausible to anyone. You got Steven Pinker and other psychologists arguing it's a classical case of evolutionary progression. They've persuaded themselves, I mean, they might as well sit in front of a mirror for the confirmation, all the confirmation they've been receiving, but they haven't persuaded Chomsky in his side of the discussion. Chomsky believes in a lucky accident, Ovid in his exile. Maybe those of us who are not professionally invested in discussion, and I'm not professionally invested in discussion, should say, there are a whole lot of problems which have, in the ripeness of their maturation, suggest it's probably more rational to say we can't solve them with the analytic tools that we have at our disposal. We can either change our analytic tools or we can wait, which seems to be commensurate with the evidence, reasonable.
Would you say Eusebius was closer to the truth than Pinker?
You mean Berossus, the Chaldean? Eusebius is just telling the story.
Yes.
No, obviously, because none of us believed that a monster emerged from the sea. And as soon as the story is queried, it becomes clear that the story itself embodies, as an assumption, many of the properties of the organism we would wish to explain, namely that it's receptive to teaching. Being receptive to teaching, being receptive to the arts of civilization, is no less a problem intellectually than having acquired the arts of civilization. If you answer the second question by an appeal to a monster, you have to answer the first question, what is it about the human being, but not the fish who continues to gulp, that made it possible for him to listen to the monster and acquire the art of dining with a fork? It's a good question, and I'm not prepared to go any further than saying it's a real good question.
Your book, The Devil's Delusion, it dealt with, it was a response largely to what's called New Atheism. That is, notable atheists using...
old arguments.
Well, yeah, old arguments and science to bolster their claims. One of the claims of not just New Atheism, but also old atheists is that religion poisons everything, as they say, and that it's bad for human morality in many ways. And people like Steven Pinker, for instance, make the argument essentially with a heavy implication that as societies become less religious and relied more on scientific reason, they've also in their moral character improved over time. What do you make of that? Do you agree with that analysis of the way I put it, and what do you make of that claim?
Well, I think there is something to what Pinker says, in that certain parts of the world, especially in the West, have successfully considered or achieved an amelioration of social injustices that are in their own way very impressive. For example, the civil rights movement. Certainly a very noble achievement of American democracy. Going back a century, the elimination of slavery, an achievement at great cost. But there is a kind of radical aspect blindness to what Pinker says, and also what Yuval Harari says, very similar, but with a morbidly unsimilar cast of mind. And that is the complete obliteration of any kind of vivid memory of what the 20th century was really like in Europe, Soviet Union, Communist China, Cambodia, Spain, half the world. The systems in place in the 20th century were unprecedented in their violence, stupidity, brutality, cruelty, and in the sum of excess deaths. And you cannot talk about improvement in morality because a greater proportion of people in the United States or England are now practicing vegetarians without at least mentioning the correlative total on the other side. And this is the fault of superficial analyses of the sort that Pinker offers. It completely dismisses the real tolls on the other side.
We have, in many thinkers like Sam Harris, for example, in The Moral Landscape, which he wrote, the idea that we can derive the principles of morality from scientific principles, and also from effectively neurobiological MRI and CAT scans.
I'm sorry, effectively from
neurobiology, and that morality can effectively be based on the analysis of the electrical impulses of the brain, and can be understood as it can be formulated through logical principles on those bases. So he understands morality as purely a epiphenomenon.
Yeah, well, this guy, is he really worth expending a lot of energy rebutting? All he's saying really is that I can derive thou shalt not kill from Newton's law of gravitation and the proposition thou shalt not kill. Sure enough, it follows thou shalt not kill. I don't see anything devastatingly of interest in Harris's analysis. We know that there is an unbridgeable wall between is and ought. Now, you can argue till you're blue in the face that Hume got it wrong, Kant got it wrong. As far as I'm concerned, they got it absolutely right. You cannot derive an ought from an is. Every attempt I've seen to make that case involves exactly the fallacy I've mentioned, assuming that you can derive A from A and B. Which is true, but uninteresting. You've stuck into the assumptions all the conclusions you want to withdraw from the argument. I think science tells us very little beyond ratifying common sense that human beings do seem to be happier in certain societies than they are in other societies. But there is no reason from that to suppose that happiness is the moral good that Harris claims it is. It may be something quite different.
And that's the distinction between is and ought. The way things are, the way things ought to be. You can't derive from the is the way things should be.
Things are matter of fact. Look, this is a very deeply embedded principle in Western philosophy. Things are the way they are. What is what is. the way they ought to be, imposes on the structure of reality a completely ethical idea. And as one would imagine, you can't derive one from the other. Doesn't mean one is less secure or intellectually less satisfying. I would suspect that some of the principles that we take for granted are more compelling than anything we may discern in the natural world. It's much more compelling to me that thou shalt not kill is true than that objects unsupported fall toward the center of the earth.
Yeah.
Both have exceptions, right? Not all objects unsupported fall toward the center of the earth. A balloon goes up, steam goes up. Well, thou shalt not kill, unfortunately, has exceptions as well, but the point is its epistemological force seems to me quite sturdy in the face of empirical cases such as the law of gravity.
What is your kind of analysis of the influence of New Atheism? Do you think it's had a serious impact on the culture?
Yeah, I do. New Atheism is a kind of a tag. I don't know whether it's new. It's certainly atheistic. But I think all the data that I've seen indicates that in the United States, which is certainly the important test case, there's an increasing self-identification as secularist. Right. That is, no religious affiliations. Yeah. Which is quite a change.
Yeah. I mean, there is also, at least in the UK from what we've seen, there is also now a trend of a lot of people saying they're spiritual but not religious.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, that works.
Yeah. Their religious convictions have been seriously broken down, but there still seems to be some sense of we must be more than, Christopher Hitchens said, I don't have a body, I am a body. And a lot of people don't like that. That
couldn't be right, could it?
No, his body's
then he would have survived death.
Yeah.
Because his body survived death, didn't it?
Yeah.
Now, I asked Christopher Hitchens about that, and he had no response to that. But in all fairness, he wasn't really worried over much at the time about logic. Yeah. But everybody who says they're identical to their body must confront the fact that the body survives as a corpse.
Yes.
But presumably they don't.
Yeah. I mean, I see it as a doctor quite often. I mean, we confirm dead bodies on a daily basis, almost, especially in intensive care. And you see the body living, and then 2 minutes later you see the body dead. And my brother put it once very nicely. He said the difference is what it reminded him of is an egg cracked and the yolk poured out. That is a perfect description of the corpse. And fundamentally, not an atom has changed in the constitution of that body.
No.
But there has been a radical change. Well, it's not the same.
Yeah, something is left.
Something is left.
Yeah.
Do you think that... So there does seem to be this innate sense of, dare I say innate, or that people are more than their bodies. And that seems to be difficult to expunge in a way. But having said that, since religion has become so weakened in the West, do you see religious ideas ever really making a comeback?
Religious experience, the need for religious experience, does not disappear. But a willingness to embrace it, like the willingness to embrace certain figures as public poets of their age, that fluctuates with time. And very often when public religious experience disappears, or it's forced underground, or it becomes attenuated, it's replaced with a lot of frivolous doctrines and dogmas. Everybody noticed in the 20th century that some part of fascism, some part of communism, represented a religious impulse, an ideological fantasy, a fixity of purpose, a certain degree of fanaticism. It's being discharged, as far as I can tell, in the contemporary world with a number of bizarre cults. For the moment political. But there are subcults, a revival of interest in witchcraft, for example. Began as a joke, and it's now taken seriously by any number of loopy women. Bizarre beauty products, tattooing, things of that sort. I mean, the issue of tattooing is very interesting. What was clearly considered a moral abomination in my youth, among Jews, for example, preventing burial in a Jewish cemetery, has now become an accepted form of decoration. So some part of our power to imposed taboos under normal circumstances of life has been switched from certain kinds of sexual taboos to certain kinds of body decoration taboos. Things that were taboo 50 years ago are no longer taboo, and we're reimposing taboos on other parts of our behavior. That is constant, but the form it takes differs.
You see these all as religious impulses almost.
Look, Pascal said very reasonably that every human being is born with a God-sized hole in his heart. And I think that's true. It doesn't mean he acts on it or is prepared to fill it, but the impulse is attested in every literature and every time in every era. It hasn't disappeared in the 21st century. It's just taken a lot of weirdo forms. I mean, the cult of social justice is plainly a messianic cult.
Dr. Berlinski, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, those at home, for watching. Please do make sure you subscribe to Rational Religion, and we're going to have more interviews and more content on these issues coming out soon. So from us at Rational Religion, peace be upon you.